itself, due to a string of weak sultans who are too young or too incapable to lead the empire. This is what happens when you have a string of sultans who don't grow up in the provinces and don't learn governance. This time period was known as the Sultanate of Women, a 130-year period in the Ottoman Empire in which the wives and mothers of the imperial harem held extraordinary levels of political power. Although the queen mothers had already gained influence in the court, they had always ruled in an informal fashion as de facto advisors or administrators. Her stewardship of the empire, however, was the first time in Ottoman history that a queen mother was chosen the official regent of her son. Kösem would meet with foreign ambassadors and discuss international treaties. She appointed political posts and had responsibility for the maintenance of the state's administration. Kösem made alliances with statesmen and judges and military leaders and other figures in the court. She effectively ran the empire for 3 generations through husbands, then her sons, then her grandchild. And Ibrahim was unfortunate to be in the middle of this political war zone. All right, well, let's get back to Ibrahim. Ibrahim spent his childhood and young adult life watching his siblings take power, take the throne, execute rivals, and then face execution themselves by usurpers. His older brother, Murat IV, for example, ordered the execution of his brothers Bayazit, Suleiman, and Qasim. The young Prince Ibrahim couldn't help but wonder when he would be strangled also, the preferred method of execution according to Ottoman interpretation of Islamic law. During Sultan Murat's reign, Ibrahim had been a prisoner, and for the 8-year period until he became sultan, carried the daily expectation of death most likely. Murat IV was terminally ill by 1640 of cirrhosis of the liver. In the final days of his reign, the Sultan's dying wish was to have Ibrahim killed. Even though the dynasty of the House of Osman that had ruled the empire for 3 centuries was coming to an end and it would be wiped out if Murat did this, he decided that he didn't want a madman as sultan. But his order wasn't carried out. While the Ottoman court knew of Ibrahim's loose connection with reality, the consequences of the collapse of the Ottoman line would be far worse than this type of outcome. The Middle Eastern political tradition of the time emphasized pedigree as one of the most important factors of whether one was fit for command or not. Even if you were severely mentally ill, your background could matter more. And if the line of Osman was wiped out, then another upstart from another pedigree that was the same or even better could take over. An ambitious upstart descended from another illustrious Islamic or Central Asian ruler, such as a descendant of Genghis Khan, or a descendant of Timur the Tartar, who conquered a lot of Persia and Central Asia in the 1400s, could have a strong claim to the empire. Court officials decided to spare the life of Ibrahim, but the paranoid young man could hardly believe his good stroke of fortune. When the chief advisor of the empire, the Grand Vizier, Kemankesh Kara Mustafa Pasha, hurried to his apartment to announce the death of Murat and proclaim him sultan, Ibrahim was terrified and thought it was a trick and his executioners were coming, so he barred the door. Ibrahim refused to believe his brother had died. He was only convinced when his mother Kösem ordered the body of her dead son shown to him. Well, Ibrahim took power with no brothers or nephews to contest him, offering him a break from possible execution by a rival political faction. Over his lifetime, he produced 9 male heirs, 3 of whom went on to become sultans themselves, including Mehmet IV, Suleiman II, and Ahmet II. And these sons ruled one after another up until the 1690s. But despite lacking a male challenger, Ottoman court scheming never ended. Only 8 years after becoming sultan, a dethroned Ibrahim was murdered. Well, you can imagine that a palace shut-in with no political experience was poorly suited to lead the Ottoman Empire, which was a global empire that spanned 3 continents. This included North Africa, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Arabian Peninsula, and up to the modern-day border with Iran, and even the Crimea and the southern coast of modern-day Ukraine. But nevertheless, the young sultan did his best in the early years of his reign as sultan. Ibrahim kept Murat's Grand Vizier, Kemankesh Kara Mustafa Pasha, and the chief legal scholar of the empire, Zakariyazadeh Yahya Effendi. Both lasted in office until 1644. The Grand Vizier was allowed to take the lead in governance, and he carried over the reform policies from the previous administration and did a good job. He achieved such political successes as negotiating peace with Iran, the traditional foe on the Ottoman Empire's eastern border. Ibrahim ruled at the height of Ottoman land possessions. The empire stretched from Istanbul to Hungary in the west, down to the Arabian Peninsula, up into the Caucasus Mountains and modern-day Ukraine in the east and north. But it was also a time of growing foreign challenges to Ottoman supremacy. The Crimean sea fortress Azov went back and forth with the Cossacks. Local revolts sprung up across Anatolia in 1643 before suppression. Dozens of fortresses were captured along its border with the Habsburg Empire. Meanwhile, 80 Venetian ships patrolled waters in the Dardanelles, the strait that connected Istanbul to the Mediterranean Sea, and whose blockade could cripple the Ottoman economy, which would happen later. As these challenges grew, Ibrahim didn't rise to the challenge. He began abusing his office to seek out pleasure wherever he could find it, making up for years of freedom lost in the harem. His long imprisonment and desire to make up for lost time made his greed override his timidity. The 19th century Austrian historian and diplomat Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, a pioneer of Turkology in the West, who spent decades in the Ottoman archives, looked in particular distaste at Ibrahim's greed. He wrote, "Under Ibrahim, the worst evils that had prevailed in the time of Sultan Murat's weakest predecessors were quickly revived, while the spirit of cruelty, in which Murat had governed, continued to rage with even greater enormity."
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
In a way, kind of like the Romanov family, the Russian royals in the early 20th century, fell under the spell of Rasputin, the mystic and self-proclaimed healer, Ibrahim's poor mental health left him susceptible to scammers and quacks. He found a spiritual advisor named Jinji, or Demon Chaser Hoja, which was the nickname for Karabashzadeh Hussein Effendi, the spiritualist and fraud who worked his way into the palace under the invitation of Qasem Sultan in order to cure Ibrahim. He thought that this method could cure his mental illness, and he had a spiritual problem instead of a biological or psychological problem. Jinji Hoja rose rapidly in the palace. Ibrahim appointed him judge and administrator over Istanbul's Galata district in 1643. The next year, he became one of the two chief military judges in the Ottoman Empire, one of the highest positions you could have. Other officials were reasonably furious. Jinji Hoja supplanted the chief legal scholar in importance as the authority of spiritual matters for the Sultan, among other things. But he had a terrible understanding of theological matters and an even worse understanding of politics. In 1644, a group of Maltese pirates attacked a small fleet of Ottoman ships that happened to be carrying pilgrims to Mecca, the holy Muslim city. Among the crew was the chief black eunuch of the Ottoman Empire, the head of the imperial harem, and one of the most important administrators of the empire. The pirates carted off the treasure to the Republic of Venice. Istanbul considered Venice and the pirates to be working together, and the kidnapping to be an act of war on the part of Venice. Jinji Hoja pushed for going to war over this incident, and he was joined by other members of the Ottoman Imperial Council. They got their wish in 1645 with the beginning of the Ottoman-Venetian War, the fifth conflict between the two states in their centuries of rivalry for naval superiority of the eastern Mediterranean. War raged on intermittently until 1669, crippling the economies of Venice and Istanbul. The war went well at first for the Ottomans. In 1645, the Ottoman Armada arrived off the contested island of Crete and conquered the fortress city of Candia on the northern coast. In keeping with classical forms of Islamic warfare, they transformed the primary cathedral of the city into a mosque and named it after Ibrahim. But whatever favor these advisors thought they would curry with Ibrahim for going to war ended up short-lived. The overall commander, Silah Dar Yusuf Pasha, faced criticism when he returned to Istanbul for his handling of the siege and for returning with so little plunder. Yusuf Pasha was ordered to return to Crete, but he refused because the winter months made for dangerous sailing in the Mediterranean. And this was known since antiquity, that you did not sail on the Mediterranean in the winter because conditions were so harsh that you were openly risking being shipwrecked. But Ibrahim ignored this very well-known conventional wisdom, and he ordered his execution. The Crete siege dragged on for decades, with Ottoman shipping attacked in the Mediterranean. From 1648 to 1649, Venetian forces blocked the Dardanelles, Istanbul's main shipping line, preventing Ottoman fleets from sailing into the Aegean and preventing goods to come by ship to Istanbul, which was the main way that goods came, and Istanbul was heavily dependent on outside cities for food, for other resources. The Ottoman treasury dried up as war dragged on with Venice. Unrest grew in the provinces as enough troops couldn't be fielded to maintain order due to lack of funds. Unchecked groups of brigands harassed peasants. And against the backdrop of all this domestic turmoil, Ibrahim occupied himself in the harem, caring little about what was happening to the empire, about domestic and international threats outside the walls of his palace. Ibrahim tried to fashion himself as a ruler from antiquity, directly out of legend. Ottoman citizens looked upon the behavior of the Sultan with a mix of contempt and fear that he was invoking God's wrath. Joseph Hammer Purgstall writes that he appeared in public with his beard adorned with jewels, an embellishment that, according to folk tradition, was only worn by the pharaoh in the Old Testament story of the Exodus. Precious stones encrusted one of his chariots. Enormous sums were spent on a skiff that bore the Sultan along the Bosphorus. As a self-appointed marksman, Ibrahim practiced archery on subjects within his range. His power had always been heavily curtailed, but episodes such as these and his behavior convinced military leaders and palace officials that his sultanate needed to come to an end. In addition to his subjects, Ibrahim treated the hundreds of concubines in his harem with equal amounts of contempt, or at least those who didn't manipulate him. Moldovan statesman Dmitry Jantomir wrote, "In the palace gardens he frequently assembled all the virgins, made them strip themselves naked, and neighing like a stallion, ran among them, and as it were, ravished one or the other, kicking or struggling by his order. When he met the daughter of the Shaykhul Islam, the chief legal scholar, he proposed marriage. The Shaykhul Islam knew Ibrahim well and told his daughter to refuse. Ibrahim responded by having the girl kidnapped. He ravaged her for days and then sent her back to her father." Ibrahim also developed a craze for scents and furs and sought to decorate his palace in expensive pelts. This idea was inspired by stories from his palace court members of legendary princes who covered themselves, furniture, and their entire palaces in expensive furs from floor to ceiling. He called on his imperial council, the ulama, and military officials to collect furs throughout the empire to make this dream a reality. To buy these expensive items in abundance, Ibrahim sold offices of the state and the administrative and military branches to the highest bidder. He also created two new taxes, the fur tax and the amber tax. One morning he went to the imperial council and demanded that it send letters to all provincial governors, commanding them to collect and forward to Istanbul a certain number of sable skins. He made a similar request to the heads of the religious, civil, and military branches of the government. Some responded with anger. Mehmet Çelebi, the judge of the Istanbul district of Galata, appeared before the Grand Vizier wearing the humble clothing of a religious mystic, and he reproached him for the foolishness of the government. The judge demanded an audience with the Sultan. He said, "There can but happen to me one of three things. You may kill me, and in that case I shall think myself fortunate in being made a martyr. Or you may banish me from Istanbul, which will not be unpleasant, as there have been several shocks of earthquakes here lately. Or perhaps you will deprive me of my employments. But in that I have saved you the trouble. I have appointed my deputy and have changed my judge's robe and turban for the dervish's gown and cap." The vizier couldn't do anything but look at him with amazement for his boldness. Well, rank-and-file Ottomans reacted to the new fur taxes with equal amounts of rage, but they had far less diplomacy. One commander of the Janissaries, which were the elite infantry troops, named Kara Murat, returned from Crete around 1646 in the course of the Ottoman-Venetian War. A treasury official who met him on arrival had the unfortunate responsibility of explaining to him the Sultan's new fur tax. The imperial council demanded of him sable skins, a fixed quantity of amber, and a sum of money. He rolled his eyes, quote, bloodshot with wrath, unquote, on the tax gathered, and the commander growled in response. "I have brought nothing back from Crete but gunpowder and lead. Sable and amber are things I know only by name. Money I have none, and if I am to give it to you, I must first beg or borrow it." When Ibrahim couldn't raise enough money for his indulgences due to responses like this, he turned to the confiscation of heritable property. Ottoman chroniclers blame Ibrahim's downfall primarily on powerful women in his harem. He elevated 8 of his concubines to the position of royal consorts, a position that was previously held by one woman. The position also came with it a daily stipend of thousands of silver coins, which was an amount higher than leading officials. Ibrahim allowed his favorite concubines to take what they pleased from shops and bazaars,